Good morning. Well, good afternoon. Damn it. Good afternoon, Stuart. Thank you so much for spending time with me again.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So in a previous interview, you talked quite quickly about small, meaningful initiatives that we can carry through to completion rather than Olympic events. I'm wondering, I'm not asking for a prescription of what I should do tomorrow, but I'm wondering can you give me an example? What does that look like?
Well, when we think about doing something, we initially have an idea in our heads, but because as adults, we've had to survive all sorts of things that have gone on that have been quite challenging. We've developed a whole lot of other selves, in a sense, that censor those initial ideas. And so quite often what people say is something that can satisfy the questioner, and maybe sound good to say, currently an acceptable thing to say, and so forth. So it's not really what we really deep down want to do. And so that's, in psychological terms, that's what's called a compensatory adaptive process. So for example, one might have an idea about doing something very small, but in the culture we live in, there's a lot of pressure to be impressive. So people often say they will do things that are much bigger than they could actually ever do. And because it's not what they really want to do, they're probably not going to do them anyway. So the challenge is, how do you find what you really want to do without that subconscious censoring going on? And it was only by accident that I discovered this. By one day running a workshop with graziers, I'd asked them what they would do to make their operation sustainable. And they said all these sort of adaptive things, that would be all right to say in front of your neighbors. And I was really upset with this going on. And without thinking about it, I said, okay, you guys, you get back in your pairs and you boldly lie about what you've already done to make your operation sustainable that you haven't actually done, as a bold lie. And the noise in the room was deafening. And we had a go round. And the guy who was first was actually the one who had been first in the previous go round. In the previous go round, he had said, "I'll put a solar collector on my dam," you see. And his lie was, this is what he'd done that he hasn't done. He said, 20 years ago, I put a nature strip right through my 200,000 hectare property, and I've been monitoring the bird species ever since. He says, I got 200 birds now. And he said, with a glint in his eye, got up this morning to monitor me birds. And then he said, you know those little bloody dinosaurs? I saw one of those bastards coming out of my nature strip. Now, I was blown away by this. Just the difference between his first statement and his lie. And so I had no idea why this was what was going on. But intuitively, I thought, we've got to work with this. So I said to them all, go back into your pairs and reflect on what you've actually done that's got anything to do with your lie. And he said that it put a windbreak between two paddocks. And he'd been noticing the birds on these trees. And he thought, if I was a bird, I'd want more than one row of trees. So he'd been thinking about planting some more trees and some undergrowth for these birds. So he'd actually been in the back of his mind thinking about how to put in a nature strip. So then I worked with the group in an approach that's based on a social psychologist called Kurt Levine, called something I've forgotten. But anyway, it basically is saying, you know, if you're going to take an action, what do you need to take that action, and how will you get it, and what might get in the way, and how will you get around those sort of barriers? And finally, you make a commitment for a doable action that is what I was referring to, or you were referring to. What's the small, meaningful initiative you can carry through to completion? So it was a way of getting to that, that action. Now that's the action for each individual that is the most meaningful action that deep down they're committed to taking and want to take and will take. And that's a way to get to it, is if if I was working with a group of people and they say, how do I know what to do? I would say, let's get in pairs, boldly lie about what you've done, the absolute first thought that comes up that you've done that you haven't done. And then I'd go through that same process and boil it down to what's the action that would be the first thing they could do towards their lie that's doable. And that's how genuine change, meaningful change, can be identified and carried out. And all other efforts that I know of are in one way or another manipulative. So they're somebody else's agenda for you rather than your own agenda. So that's the really important thing about that.
Very interesting, I find, to think about efforts that are manipulated, because as someone becomes more influential, have to consciously not manipulate other people.
Yeah. So part of it is becoming better at listening. So for example, when somebody's telling me something, I'll listen, and then I'll often say, instead of saying anything myself about, in response, I would say, I'm just wondering if you could tell me a bit more about that. And then when they say a bit more, I say, oh, that, some particular aspect of it was so interesting. I really you got me fascinated with this. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. And so eventually you in a sense, you exhaust the sharing. And in the process, you're actually enabling the speaker to think through what it is they're talking about in a way that is normally not possible, because most people, when they're listening, they're basically waiting for the other one to finish. And if they don't finish quick enough, they interrupt and then say something about themselves.
Yeah. I dare not do that.
Well, it was interesting. At one time I worked as a psychotherapist, and I said I would only see the clients once. And I said to them they could come whenever they wanted to. We'd schedule a session, and the session could last as long as you like. And the interesting thing is, when people have that sense that they're going to be listened to, they actually don't take a lot of time. So all of these sessions, and there were hundreds of them, everyone went over an hour, which is the normal psychology session, is 1 hour. Everyone went over an hour. So people obviously needed more than an hour. But only one out of the hundreds went over 2 hours. And that person was seriously psychotic.
Hmm. Wow. Is that a reflection on their never being listened to before? And so they were surprised to be given permission to speak for so long?
No, that might be part of it, but it's a much more profound thing, in a sense, that was going on. What happens is, for us, is the worst wounding that we receive psychologically, we receive when we're very, very young, before we have language.
Mm.
And that might be, in my generation, there was a culture of letting children, you're putting them down in a bed, and if they cried, you let them stay there and they would go to sleep. You wouldn't pick them up because, that would spoil them. Now, for a small child, if you're left alone, whereas the adult thinks, well, they'll know, I'll come back, they'll be fine. Of course, a small child has no understanding that anybody's coming back. So as far as a small child is concerned, they've been abandoned forever.
Yeah.
So the extrapolation, which is what small children do from a situation, is to infinity. What would happen if you've been abandoned is you'll eventually die. Mm-hmm. So our earliest psychological wounding is connected to a fear of death. And so when we work on our woundedness in therapy, we're actually, the most important stuff is connected to a fear of death. And so even talking about it, because it occurred before language, is very difficult. And for a client to talk about it, they have to know that the therapist will not let them die if they do that, if they talk about it. Now, most therapists don't communicate that they're not going to let the client die. And what happened in my one session was I was communicating to the client two things. One is, this is your only chance. And two, that I'm up to dealing with whatever you deal with in your one session, which they subconsciously translated as, he's up to not letting me die. And so people, every one of these people in their sessions, even though they may have been in therapy, some of them for years, in fact, one person for 25 years, had never talked about what they talked with me about and worked on with their therapist or ever before in their life. And it was my two big discoveries in life, really, in psychotherapy. One is the power of the one session, and the other is the value of boldly lying about what you haven't done, that you haven't done, as if you've done it.
Well, could we end this discussion with a lie?
Okay.
Going out on a limb here, aren't we? The current situation is the pandemic. My lie is that I survived. I survived, and I was able to help. And I look back on the pandemic as something that taught me a lot about what I was actually able to do. And I was able to shed my knowledge through useful channels and grow as a better communicator. That's my lie. And I have been practicing this technique since I first saw you introduce it to me a couple of decades ago, I suppose. And I do, before I go to sleep, I do think about, with gratitude, about what I was able to do. A little thing. Oh, yes.
Fantastic.
I was able to do that. And that actually seeds hope for the future for me. And it keeps me on a pathway towards the bold lie. And it helps me sometimes when things have gone awry. I go, okay, that's fine. We'll just do something small, and that will maybe one day compensate for a disaster.
Right.
I mean, I have disasters. There are always disasters. One of my greatest disaster was not wanting to dwell on it, but I had a hand-raised goose, and her name was Snowy, and she was quite a celebrity on Facebook. Snowy was, and one night I drove home from a performance because I'm a musician, and I was just dead tired. Had to remove all my makeup and the costume, and I collapsed on the lounge and fell asleep. Well, the fox came and killed Snowy. Well, Snowy was never happy living as a goose anyway. She was always complaining about having to sleep with the geese and not in my bathroom. And so she was not happy in that existence. And she would even be able to put her wings around me. She was amazing, great companion, and yeah, it was a disaster. But I guess the next night I would still try to be grateful for the things that I was doing that was still on track. Yeah. So I find it works really well for me in managing disaster, but also just managing in the day-to-day existence of where I feel I want to go. I don't have a set plan, but where I feel I want to go. And then I know that I'm shaping my way towards that. And
Fantastic.
I know when the pieces fall into place, the vision is starting to crystallize.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when the pieces just rot or explode, I know that the other pieces are in place to continue the vision.
Right.
It's a bit tricky with the pandemic and being confined, but I'm so grateful that I have outdoor activities because they're very good for me spiritually, to go into nature and enjoy that.
Right.
I wouldn't be so ready.
I think that going into nature is really, really important, particularly, and not only just going into nature in the present, but also remembering nature that you went into very early in your life, before, say, age 7, and trying to remember like precious places in nature. That's really helpful to do as a memory, particularly for people, for example, people who are disabled and can't get up and walk. Being able to go to those places are really important. And the other thing that I should have mentioned also, that I did with the people in the exercise, was to identify somebody who could be an ally to them in taking their small, meaningful action. And that's because deep down, we're a social species. We're a we species, not an I species.
Yeah.
And it's really important to reclaim our ability to be we in a lot of situations where in our culture, we're encouraged to be I.
Yeah. Well, Paul, my husband, and I did a cooking class 2 weeks ago, and I said, I grow stuff and Paul cooks it. And and it's true. Actually, I grow stuff and he chops it down. Well, he tries to get through the jungle. And then when it was his turn, he goes, yeah, April grows stuff and I cook it. And that was a great, woohoo! Great
Yeah,
acknowledgement.
fantastic.
Yeah. It sounds so
It's great.
trivial, but it was a good, really good thing for me, for him to acknowledge that I grow most of the
Yeah.
stuff.
I think that's really important. And particularly at this time, my heart goes out to all those people who are alone
Yeah.
dealing with this, as
Yeah.
opposed to the fortunate people like you and me who've got partners who can
Yeah.
be such an important help at
Yeah.
these times.
Well, thank you. I've got more to think about. Certainly never bored in your company. I'm going to close this question and ask one more if I may. Thank
Fine.
you.